Liberalism, section. Grotius, Locke, and the Founding Fathers, a comparative interpretation. At the start of the 18th century, Daniel Defoe underlined the ideological fraternity between the country that had emerged from the Glorious Revolution and the country which, a century earlier, had rebelled against Philip II and won, quote, freedom and prosperity, thanks to, quote, heaven and the assistance of England. In the mid-19th century, liberal authors liked to contrast the ordered triumph of liberty that had occurred in Holland, England, and the United States, with a France in the grip of an interminable revolutionary cycle and Bonapartism. It might therefore be useful to proceed to a brief comparative analysis of the texts and authors in which the liberal revolutions of these three countries found theoretical expression and consecration. In the case of Holland, we cannot but refer to Hugo Grotius, who dedicated two of his most important books, Annales et Historiae de Rebus Belgis and De Antiquitate Republicae Batavicae, to the revolt against Philip II and the country that derived from it. Liberal Holland immediately engaged in overseas expansion and slave trading, and it is interesting to observe the position Grotius adopted towards colonial peoples. Having condemned the superstitious and idolatrous character of the, quote, religious rites peculiar to paganism, he added, quote, when offered to an evil spirit, it is an act of falsehood and hypocrisy. Nay, it is an act of absolute rebellion, whereby we not only deprive our legal sovereign of his just homage, but even transfer that homage to a base apostate and an open enemy. End quote. Targeted here were peoples with, quote, modes of worship of a nature little suited to a being of goodness and purity, human sacrifices, naked races up and down the temples, games and dances replete with obscenity, instances whereof are seen even at this day among the savage natives of America and Africa, who are still lost in the thick clouds of paganism. End quote. It was peoples assailed by Europe's colonial expansion who were guilty of rebellion against God, and who must be punished for such a crime. Quote, some are weak enough to imagine that God, as a being of infinite goodness, will never be provoked to punish this rebellion. A spirit of revenge, that say they, is wholly incompatible with the attribute of perfect goodness. A fatal and absurd idea, this. The powers of mercy must be limited, that her actions may be just, and when wickedness becomes excessive, punishment, as it were, unavoidably arises out of justice. End quote. Against peoples who, staining themselves with, quote, offenses that are committed against God, and violating the most basic norms of natural law, took the form of barbarians, or, quote, rather beasts than men. War was natural, regardless of state borders and geographical distance. Indeed, quote, the justest war is that which is undertaken against wild rapacious beasts, and next to it is that against men who are like beasts. End quote. This is the ideology that presided over the conquest of the New World. The sin of idolatry was the first of the arguments, prompting Sepulveda to regard war on the Indians and their enslavement as just. And in Grotius, along with the implicit legitimation of the genocidal practices underway in America, an explicit and insistent justification of slavery emerges. Sometimes it was punishment for criminal behavior. Answerable for the latter were not only single individuals, quote, a whole people may be brought into subjection for a public crime, end quote. As well as in their capacity as rebels against the Lord of the universe. The inhabitants of America and Africa could also succumb to slavery as a result of a, quote, just war, bellum justum, conducted by a European power. The prisoners captured during an armed conflict, formally declared in the requisite forms by the supreme authority of a state, were legitimately slaves. And their descendants, too, were legitimate slaves. Otherwise, what interest would the victor have in keeping the vanquished alive? As the slave of the one who had spared his life, the prisoner became part of the victor's property, and such property could be transmitted hereditarily or be an object of sale, just like, quote, the property of goods, rerum dominium, end quote. Naturally, all this did not apply to, quote, those nations where this right of bondage over captives is not practiced. And it did not apply to Christian countries, which limited themselves to exchanging prisoners. Banned in intra-European conflicts, slavery by right of war continued to be a reality as and when Christian, civilized Europe confronted colonial peoples, barbarians and pagans, in what by definition was a, quote, just war. On the other hand, regardless of their actual behavior, the lesson of a great master should not be forgotten. Quote, as Aristotle said, some men are naturally slaves, that is, turned for slavery. And some nations, also, are of such a temper, that they know better how to obey than to command. End quote. This was a truth also confirmed by Holy Scripture. Quote, the Apostle St. Paul called on individuals and peoples who had legitimately been reduced to slavery to put up with their lot, and not escape it by rebellion or flight. On the one hand, Grotius paid homage to the free people, who in Holland had availed themselves of their right of resistance, legitimately shaking off the yoke of a despotic prince. On the other, he had no difficulty justifying slavery, and even the kind of, quote, wild beast hunt against Indians underway in America. Let us now pass on to the Glorious Revolution and Locke. The two treatises of government may be regarded as key moments in the ideological preparation and consecration of the event that marks the birth of liberal England. We are dealing with texts deeply impregnated with the pathos of liberty, the condemnation of absolute power, the appeal to rise up against the wicked ones who seek to deprive man of his liberty and reduce him to slavery. But every now and then, frightening passages open up in this ode to liberty, where slavery in the colonies is legitimized. As ultimate proof of the legitimacy of the institution, Grotius adduced the example of the Germans, who, according to Tacitus's testimony, quote, ventured their very liberty upon the cast of a die. In Locke's view, quote, captives taken in a just war, on the part of the victors, had, quote, forfeited their lives and, with it, their liberties. They were slaves, subjected to the absolute dominion and arbitrary power of their masters. End quote. Up to now, the thinking applies to blacks deported from Africa. But the fate reserved for Indians was not manifestly better. In addition to having an interest in the slave trade as a shareholder in the Royal African Company, the liberal English philosopher was concerned with the white colonists' expansionist march as secretary, in 1673-74, of the Council of Trade and Plantations. As has been justly observed, quote, that so many of the examples Locke uses in his second treatise are American ones, shows that his intention was to provide the settlers, for whom he had worked in so many other ways, with a powerful argument based in natural law rather than legislative decree to justify their depredations. End quote. The second treatise makes repeated reference to the wild Indian who moved around, quote, insolent and injurious in the woods of America, or the, quote, vacant places of America. Ignorant of labor, which was the only thing that could confer property right, and occupying a land not, quote, improved by labor, or great tracts of unused ground, the Indian inhabited, quote, unpossessed quarters, in vacuus locis. In addition to labor and property, Indians were also ignorant of money. They thus not only proved alien to civilization, but were also, quote, not joined with the rest of mankind. As a result of their behavior, they were not solely subject to human condemnation. Unquestionably, quote, God commanded labor and private property, and could certainly not want the world created by him to remain, quote, common and uncultivated. When he sought to challenge the march of civilization, violently opposing exploitation through labor of the uncultivated land occupied by him, the Indian, along with any other criminal, could be equated with, quote, one of those wild savage beasts with whom men can have no society nor security, and who, quote, therefore may be destroyed as a lion or a tiger, end quote. Locke never tired of insisting on the right possessed by any man to destroy those reduced to the level of, quote, beasts of prey, savage beasts, to the level of a, quote, savage ravenous beast that is dangerous to his being, end quote. These are phrases that remind us of those used by Grotius in connection with barbarous peoples and pagans in general, and by Washington in connection with the Indians. However, before coming to the Founding Fathers and the solemn documents that mark the birth of the United States, it is worth dwelling on another macroscopic exclusion clause that characterizes the celebration of liberty in Locke. Papists declared the essay concerning toleration are, quote, like serpents, never to be prevailed on by kind usage to lay by their venom, end quote. Even more than to English Catholics, this harsh declaration was formulated with a view to Ireland, where at the time unregistered priests were branded with a red-hot iron, when they were not punished with more severe penalties or death. The Irish, in endemic, desperate revolt against spoliation and oppression by Anglican settlers, were contemptuously referred to by Locke as a population of, quote, brigands. As for the rest, he reiterated the point the men are, quote, forward to have compassion for sufferers and esteem for that religion as pure, and the professors of it as sincere, which can stand the test of persecution. But I think it is far otherwise with Catholics, who are less apt to be pitied than others, because they receive no other usage than what they, by the cruelty of their own principles and practices, are known to deserve. End quote. The warning against feelings of compassion makes it clear that we are dealing with Ireland primarily. Locke seems to have had no objections of any kind to the ruthless repression suffered by the Irish, whose fate calls to mind that reserved for Indians across the Atlantic. We can now move on to examine the documents that informed the Third Liberal Revolution and the foundation of the United States. At first sight, the Declaration of Independence and the 1787 Constitution seem inspired and pervaded by a universal pathos of liberty, quote, all men are created equal. Such is the solemn preamble to the first document. It is necessary to, quote, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, end quote. Such is the no less solemn preamble to the second. But it requires a scarcely more attentive reading to encounter, already in Article 1 of the Constitution, a contrast between free persons and all other persons. The latter were, of course, slaves, whose number, reduced to 3/5, had to be factored in and added to that of free persons, when it came to calculating the number of members in the House of Representatives to which slaveholding states were entitled. With recourse to various euphemisms, a whole series of other articles refer to this. Quote, no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. End quote. Where initially it was concealed among, quote, other persons, the part of the population not made up of free persons, now the relationship of slavery is modestly subsumed under the general category of persons, quote, held to service or labor. On the basis of the principles of self-government, each individual state has the right to regulate it as it sees fit, while every state's obligation to return fugitive slaves is a moral obligation to guarantee a legitimate property owner the services that, quote, may be due. In a further linguistic expedient, tinged with the same discretion, the black slave trade becomes, quote, the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, end quote. It was, quote, not to be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808, and pending that could only be subjected to a fairly modest tax, quote, not exceeding $10 for each person or slave, end quote. The articles requiring the Union to suppress insurrections or domestic violence, primarily, a possible dreaded slave revolt in some particular state, are formulated in a similarly elliptical fashion. Although repressed through a strict linguistic prescription, the institution of slavery proves to be a pervasive presence in the American Constitution. It is not even absent from the Declaration of Independence, where the accusation against George III of having appealed to black slaves takes the already noted form of having, quote, excited domestic insurrections amongst us, end quote. In the transition from Grotius to Locke, and from them to the founding documents of the American Revolution, we observe a phenomenon worth reflecting upon. Although regarded as legitimate in all three cases, the institution of slavery was theorized and affirmed without the least reticence solely by the Dutch author, whose life straddled the 16th and 17th century. In Locke, by contrast, at least in the case of the two treatises of government, which were written and published on the eve and at the end of the Glorious Revolution, legitimation of slavery tends to occur exclusively between the lines of the discourse celebrating English liberty. The reticence reaches its peak in the documents that consecrate the foundation of the United States as the most glorious chapter in the history of liberty. When it came to the relationship with the Indians, things were different. Grotius, Locke, and Washington all referred to them as, quote, wild beasts. A document like the Declaration of Independence, which was addressed to international public opinion, and which, as we know, included among George III's most heinous crimes the fact that he had incited the, quote, merciless Indian savages against the rebel colonists, was linguistically more cautious. But it remains the case that in all three liberal revolutions, the demand for liberty and justification of the enslavement, as well as the decimation or destruction of barbarians, were closely intertwined. End section.